I've done tunnel inspections for 11 years, and the thing most people don't understand is how boring the job actually is. Not boring in a dismissive way. Boring in the way that any job is boring when you've done it long enough that your hands know what to do before your brain catches up. You drive the approach, you run the pre-entry checks, you walk the bore, you document what you find, you file the report. Cracks get measured and logged. Drainage channels get cleared or flagged. Ventilation equipment gets cycled and tested. Lighting panels get inspected column by column. You move at a pace that looks slow from the outside, but is actually just methodical, which is different. Then you drive back and do it again, somewhere else the next day. I work for a state DOT subcontractor infrastructure inspection, primarily subsurface and enclosed structures. Tunnels, underpasses, culverts, the occasional pedestrian underpass that some municipality forgot they owned. The company has maybe 40 field inspectors across 3 states and a back office team that processes our reports and argues with the agencies about remediation timelines. I've been with them since I left the Navy. I did damage control and structural assessment on ships for 6 years, got out, spent a year doing nothing useful, then found this job through a guy I knew from training who'd made the same transition. It suited me. Enclosed spaces, systematic documentation, working mostly alone. It suited me fine. I want to be clear about that before I get into any of this. I am not someone who spooks easily. I am not someone who reads meaning into things that don't have meaning. I'm not superstitious. I don't have a dramatic backstory that primed me to believe in strange things. I was a reasonably content, professionally functional, somewhat divorced man who drove to tunnels and wrote detailed reports about their structural condition. That was my life. That was the whole of it. The tunnel in question is on a secondary state highway, about 2.5 hours northwest of where I live. I'm going to call it the Harwick Bore, which isn't its real designation, but is close enough that anyone familiar with the region would probably recognize the general area. It's a single-bore, 2-lane tunnel through a ridge of Appalachian foothill geology, originally constructed in the late 1950s, just over 1,600 feet long. Not a significant structure by modern standards. Not on any list of engineering achievements. It's just a hole through a hill that a 2-lane highway uses, because going over the ridge would have added 11 miles to a route that wasn't worth 11 miles. It had been on our inspection rotation for 3 years before I was assigned to it. A guy named Terrence had been doing it. He retired in February, genuine retirement, pension, and a cake, and the whole thing, and his route got redistributed. I picked up the Harwick Bore along with 4 other structures in that corridor. My first visit was in late March, overcast day, temperature in the low 40s. I drove up the night before and stayed at a motel in a small town, about 20 minutes from the tunnel entrance. Nothing remarkable about any of it. I ate a bad sandwich from a gas station, watched part of a basketball game I didn't care about, and went to sleep at 9:30 because my entry window was 6 in the morning. The reason for the early window is traffic management. Inspections of active tunnels require a reduced flow protocol. 1 lane stays open. Traffic is controlled by flag operators at both portals, and I have a working window inside the bore before peak commuter traffic makes the protocol cost prohibitive. My window that morning was 6 to 9, 3 hours to walk 1,600 feet, which sounds generous until you're actually doing it. The flag operators were a married couple who'd been doing this kind of traffic control work for about 15 years. The woman, Diane, handled the north portal. Her husband, whose name I have genuinely forgotten, I want to say Gary, but I'm not certain, handled the south. They were already set up when I arrived. She handed me the check-in sheet. I signed. We exchanged the kind of pleasantries you exchange at 6 in the morning with strangers. and I suited up. The standard kit for a bore inspection of this type: hard hat, high-vis vest, steel-toed boots, knee pads for drainage channel work, a meter stick, a digital camera, a handheld crack width gauge, an air quality monitor clipped to the vest, a headlamp in addition to whatever tunnel lighting exists, and a clipboard with the inspection form pre-populated with the structure's known deficiency history. For a tunnel this age with a maintenance record as thin as this one's, the deficiency history was long. 32 previously documented issues ranging from minor efflorescence that's mineral deposits on the concrete, looks like white streaking, usually cosmetic, to a section of delaminated arch lining at roughly the midpoint that had been flagged for priority repair for 2 inspection cycles and still hadn't been touched. I noted that before I even walked in. That kind of delay is normal, unfortunately. Budget cycles, remediation queues, the general friction of public infrastructure maintenance. You document it, you file it, you follow up in the report. What you don't do is refuse to walk the bore because someone upstream hasn't acted on a prior recommendation. That's just the job. The tunnel lighting was functional but dim. That's also normal for a structure this age. The fixtures were sodium vapor, old enough that some of them had that yellowish flickering that comes from ballasts that should have been replaced 8 years ago. The effect inside the bore was a kind of thick amber light that didn't quite reach the walls fully, so the edges of your vision were always slightly in shadow. You get used to it. Your headlamp fills the gap. I was about 400 feet in when I noticed that the camera system was more recent than I expected. The Harwick bore had a documented camera installation from 2009. 4 fixed cameras, 1 at each portal, and 2 at roughly the quarter point of the bore, all pointed inward. Standard traffic monitoring, no active surveillance staff. Footage fed to a DOT regional server and theoretically reviewed if an incident was reported. In practice, for a tunnel this quiet, no one watched that footage in real time. It existed for documentation purposes. What I saw at the 400-foot mark was a camera that wasn't in the 2009 documentation. It was mounted higher than the originals, on a bracket that looked newer powder-coated steel rather than the galvanized mounting hardware the older cameras used. The camera itself was a different form factor. Smaller housing, a lens that looked wider angle, a small indicator light on the side of the housing that was solid green. I photographed it, noted the discrepancy on my form, and kept walking. The most obvious explanation was that someone had upgraded the system at some point, and the documentation just hadn't been updated in our records. That happens constantly. Infrastructure agencies are not known for keeping subcontractor documentation current. I made a note to request updated camera records from the DOT maintenance office when I filed the report. I found 3 more undocumented cameras in the next 800 feet, each one newer than the 2009 units, each one with that same green indicator light. The spacing wasn't regular, which I found mildly odd. The original 4 had been placed at logical intervals, but these newer ones seemed positioned without obvious pattern. One was close to the delamination section I'd been anticipating. One was within about 30 feet of the south portal, tucked high in the arch where you'd miss it if you weren't looking up. I documented all of them, finished the inspection, filed out at the south portal where the husband, whose name might have been Gary, was standing next to his truck with a coffee cup. I asked him if he knew anything about a camera upgrade in the bore. He shrugged. Traffic cameras? That's DOT business. We just do the flags. Fair enough. I filed my report that afternoon from the motel. 19 deficiency items, 3 requiring priority attention, including the delamination, which I photographed from 6 angles and annotated with measurements. I flagged the undocumented cameras as an administrative discrepancy and requested current camera inventory records from the assigned maintenance district. Then I drove home and forgot about the Harwick boar for approximately 6 weeks. The follow-up visit was scheduled for early May, triggered by an agency response to my delamination flag. They wanted a second set of measurements to confirm my assessment before approving the remediation budget. Standard procedure. I booked the same motel, confirmed the same flag crew. Diane confirmed they were available, and drove up on a Tuesday evening. This time, I brought my laptop. I'd developed a habit of doing preliminary review of prior inspection records the night before a revisit, just to make sure I wasn't walking in blind on anything that had changed in the interim. I opened my report from March, reviewed the photographs, cross-referenced the deficiency list. The DOT maintenance office had responded to my camera records request. The email had come in 2 weeks after I filed the report, and I'd skimmed it at the time without paying much attention. Now I read it properly. According to the district maintenance coordinator, the Harwick bore camera system had not been upgraded since 2009. The 4 original cameras remained in place. No additional units had been installed, and no installation was currently planned. I sat with that for a minute. Then I went back through my March photographs to make sure I hadn't made an error somewhere. Maybe I'd miscounted. Maybe one of the original cameras looked newer than it was because it had been replaced in place, housing and all, and the DOT just hadn't categorized it as an upgrade in their records. I found all 4 photographs of the undocumented units. Clear images, distinct form factor from the 2009 cameras, green indicator lights. I had the original cameras and other photographs for comparison. They were clearly different. There was another explanation, which was that someone had installed unauthorized cameras. That happens too, believe it or not. Utility companies, mobile carriers, even private researchers have been known to piggyback on existing infrastructure, especially in low-traffic, low-oversight structures. It's technically illegal, it creates liability issues, and when discovered, it generates a lot of bureaucratic noise. But it happens. I added a note to my revisit preparation. Photograph all cameras again, confirm current operational status, report to both DOT maintenance and our own project manager. I wasn't worried, I was just thorough. The next morning was cold for May, fog sitting low over the highway, the kind of morning that makes you glad for the hard hat because it keeps the damp off your head. Diane was already set up at the north portal when I arrived, same as before. We did the sign-in. She mentioned that the fog might slow traffic management, that I should expect a possible early close of my window if volume picked up unexpectedly. I acknowledged that, suited up, and entered the bore at 6:12. My plan was to walk straight to the delamination section first. Roughly the midpoint, do the measurements the agency wanted, then sweep back through both halves of the bore on my return, checking the cameras and completing any secondary documentation. Efficient routing. I got to the midpoint without incident. The delamination section looked worse than it had in March, which I noted. This isn't unusual. Temperature cycling over the spring causes concrete to expand and contract, and sections that are already compromised tend to open up. I took my measurements, re-photographed everything, updated my notes. That took maybe 40 minutes. Then I turned around to start my return sweep. The monitoring station for this tunnel, it's not staffed, just a kiosk of sorts. A metal enclosure with equipment inside is at the north end of the bore, about 60 feet from the portal. I'd passed it on the way in without stopping, because it wasn't on my priority list for this visit. On my way back, I stopped to check it, mainly out of habit. The enclosure was unlocked, which was unusual. The hasp was closed, but the padlock was hanging open. I noted it, took a photo, and opened the door. The equipment inside was what I expected. A network switch, some conduit connections, a small, uninterruptible power supply, and a monitor, a small flat screen, 8 or 9 inches, mounted at eye level, showing split feeds from the tunnel cameras. The monitor was live. That was also unusual. The system as documented wasn't configured for local display footage, was supposed to go directly to the regional server, not loop back to a local monitor. But the monitor was there, it was on, and it was showing camera feeds. 6 feeds, not 4. The 2 additional feeds were from the undocumented cameras. I recognized the angles. One was the camera I'd photographed near the delamination section, showing that stretch of bore from above. The other was the camera near the south portal. I looked at all 6 feeds for a moment, orienting myself. The feeds were labeled with small text at the bottom of each frame. Cam 1, Cam 2, Cam 3, Cam 4 were the originals. The 2 new feeds were labeled Cam 5 and Cam 6. Cam 5 was the mid-bore angle, and on Cam 5, I could see the delamination section. I could see the equipment I'd left there. My meter stick propped against the wall, my clipboard resting on the floor of the drainage channel while I'd taken measurements. I could also see myself, not in real time. Or, I need to be precise here, because this is where things get harder to explain clearly. The timestamp on the feed read 0547. My entry at the north portal had been at 0612. I had the sign-in sheet in my clipboard. Diane had watched me enter. The figure on CAM5 at timestamp 0547 was standing at the delamination section in a high-vis vest and hard hat, holding a meter stick against the wall at the exact angle I'd used to take my measurements. The posture was mine. The equipment was mine. The vest was mine. I recognized the reflective tape pattern, which had a small tear on the left shoulder that I'd been meaning to replace for 2 months. The figure on CAM5 was me at the delamination section, 25 minutes before I entered the tunnel. I stood there looking at that monitor for a long time. Then I closed the enclosure, rehung the open padlock without locking it. I don't know why I did that. Just didn't want to disturb things any more than I already had. And I walked out of the north portal into the fog. Diane looked up from her phone. "Done already?" "Equipment check," I said. "I'll be going back in." I sat in my truck for about 10 minutes. I did not have a rational explanation. I had several almost rational explanations, each of which required something to be wrong, that I couldn't easily verify. A timestamp misconfiguration on the monitor, a looped or cached recording from a prior visit, a camera angle that resembled my position without actually showing me. The vest detail bothered me. The tear bothered me specifically. I'd bought this vest 14 months ago. Terrence had done the prior 2 Harwick inspections. He wouldn't have been wearing my vest. I wrote down the timestamp, 5:47. I wrote down everything I remembered about the image. Then I went back in and finished the inspection. I finished the inspection. That's the part that probably sounds strange in retrospect. That I went back in, completed the documentation, walked the whole south half of the bore, photographed the second set of undocumented cameras, measured 2 additional deficiencies I'd missed in March, and filed out at the south portal at 8:40, where the husband whose name might be Gary was reading a paperback with the truck door open. That probably sounds like I was either very professional or very stupid. I think I was just operating on momentum. The job had a shape, and I followed the shape. That's not bravery. It's closer to the way you finish driving home, even after you've received bad news. Your hands stay on the wheel, because the road is still there. I drove back to the motel, showered, and sat at the desk with my laptop open and the photograph of the monitor on my camera's screen. The image was clear enough. I'd taken it on reflex when I first opened the enclosure. 4 photos in rapid sequence, habit from years of documenting equipment states. The monitor was visible in all 4. The timestamp was visible in 3. CAM5 in the corner of the frame, the figure at the delamination section, 0547. I spent 2 hours trying to build an explanation that held together. The most structurally sound one was timestamp error. Network-connected cameras sometimes have clock drift, especially on systems that aren't regularly maintained. If the monitor's internal clock was wrong by, say, 25 minutes running fast, then what I was seeing at the documented time of 0547 could have actually been footage from 0612 or later, displayed with an incorrect time. That would mean the figure was me, the timestamp was just wrong, and the monitor was showing a live or near-live feed with a misconfigured clock. That explanation worked right up until I remembered that I'd been at the delamination section for approximately 40 minutes, and I'd entered the bore at 0612. 40 minutes in puts me at roughly 0652. But the monitor showed me at the delamination section at 0547, and the monitor was in the north end enclosure, which I reached on my return trip, meaning I was already past the delamination section when I saw the image. If the clock was running fast by 25 minutes, I should have still been at the delamination section when the monitor showed 0547. I wasn't. I was at the north end. I wrote that down and looked at it for a while. Then I called my project manager, a woman named Sandra, who had been with the company longer than anyone and had the specific quality of making every problem sound slightly smaller than it actually was. I told her about the undocumented cameras, the DOT's denial of any upgrade, the unlocked enclosure, the monitor. I didn't mention the image on Cam 5. I'm not sure why exactly. Partly because I hadn't finished deciding what I thought it was. Partly because telling someone that you saw yourself on a security camera before you arrived is the kind of thing that changes how people hear everything else you say. Sandra said she'd contact the DOT district office directly and escalate the unauthorized equipment question. She said the unlocked enclosure was a separate liability issue that needed to go in writing. She told me to include all of it in my report, which I was already planning to do, and to make sure my photos were time-stamped from my camera's internal clock, not the monitor. They were. My camera's internal clock showed 7:31 when I photographed the monitor. That was the correct time. My entry was documented at 6:12. I left the monitor at approximately 7:33, 7:34. All of that was consistent. I filed the report that evening, included everything except the figure on CAM5. I told myself I'd add a supplemental note once I'd thought it through more carefully. I drove home the next morning. The supplemental note never got written. Instead, I spent the better part of 2 weeks doing what I think most people do when something doesn't fit. I put it in a mental drawer and let the ordinary work of ordinary days pile up on top of it. I had 4 other structures on rotation, 2 of which needed revisits of their own. I had a quarterly compliance filing. I had a weekend with my daughter, who was 9 at the time and lived with her mother about 40 minutes from me, and who wanted to spend the entire visit teaching me a card game she'd invented that had rules that changed every time I started to understand them. I let the drawer stay closed. The thing about closed drawers is that they don't lock. I got an email from the DOT district office in the 3rd week of May. Not from the maintenance coordinator I'd been corresponding with, but from someone in their security and infrastructure division. A department I hadn't known existed, or at least hadn't interacted with directly before. The email was brief, formal, asked me to confirm the camera positions I'd documented, and specifically asked whether I had observed any network hardware inside the north end enclosure beyond what was included in their 2009 infrastructure manifest. The 2009 manifest was attached to the email. I opened it. 4 cameras. The network switch, which matched what I'd seen. The UPS standard conduit. No monitor. I wrote back and confirmed the camera positions from my photographs and described the monitor. I asked if the monitor was their equipment or if it represented additional unauthorized installation. The response came 2 days later. The monitor was not their equipment. They were initiating an inquiry. They asked me not to access the north end enclosure again until the inquiry was complete. I said that was fine. Then I asked, because I was already typing, and it seemed like the right moment. Could they tell me whether their server had any recorded footage from the Harwick bore cameras timestamped between 5:30 and 6 a.m. on the morning of my May inspection? I didn't say why I was asking. The response to that one took 4 days and came from a different address, the same security division, but a name I hadn't seen before. It said that their server logs showed no footage recorded from Harwick bore cameras prior to 6 a.m. on any date in the past calendar year. The system was configured to activate on motion detection, and their logs showed no motion events before my entry. No footage before 6 a.m., which meant that whatever the monitor in the enclosure had been displaying, whatever I'd seen on Cam 5 at 0547, it hadn't been coming from the DOT's server. I read that email 3 times. Then I opened the drawer and took out everything I'd put in it. The monitor was showing a feed. That feed was live enough that it had a timestamp running. CAM5 was an undocumented camera that the DOT hadn't installed and hadn't acknowledged. The monitor itself wasn't their equipment, which meant the whole secondary system, the 4 undocumented cameras, the local monitor, whatever was recording or transmitting that footage, was installed by someone else, running on separate hardware, and showing me at the delamination section 25 minutes before I entered the bore. I thought about that last part for a long time. The figure's posture, the tear on the vest, the exact angle of the meter stick against the wall. There was one more explanation I hadn't fully examined, and it was the one I'd been avoiding because it required me to accept a different kind of error. Not a timestamp error, not a clock drift. What if the monitor wasn't showing footage from that morning at all? What if it was showing footage from a future moment from my inspection, still ongoing when I reached the enclosure, a moment that hadn't happened yet from my perspective, but was already recorded? That makes no physical sense. I know that. I'm not a person who uses phrases like temporal anomaly and seriousness, but I'd been a damage control specialist. I'd spent 6 years in a profession where you identify what's actually failing rather than what you wish was failing, because the difference matters. And what was actually failing here, what didn't fit any explanation I could assemble, was the sequence. The image showed me before I was there. I decided to go back. I want to be honest about why, because it would be easy to frame it as professional obligation, the structural inspection follow-up, the DOT's inquiry. All of that was real. But the actual reason I decided to go back, the thing that tipped it, was the tear in the vest. My daughter had put that tear there. She'd caught her finger in the reflective tape during a visit about 8 weeks before the May inspection, tugging at it to feel the texture, and I'd heard the small sound of it separating, and looked over, and she'd looked up at me with an expression preparing to be sorry, and I'd told her it was fine. It was a work vest. It didn't matter. I hadn't repaired it because every time I noticed it during an inspection, I thought of that moment, and I had not yet decided whether that was a reason to fix it or a reason to leave it. The figure on CAM5 was wearing that vest, with that tear, which meant it was not a prior recording. It was not Terrence. It was me in my current vest, and that image had existed at 5:47 a.m. before I walked into the bore. I booked the motel for the second week of June. I told Sandra I was doing a voluntary revisit to support the DOT inquiry, which was plausible enough that she didn't question it. I also did something I hadn't done for any prior visit. I went through the public records portal for the county and pulled the historical permit and construction records for the Harwick bore. The original 1957 construction documents, the 1973 lining resurfacing, a 1989 electrical upgrade, and everything since. I was looking for anything that didn't match the physical structure I'd walked. The 1957 construction documents described the bore as 1,612 feet from portal to portal. That was consistent with my measurements. The structural cross-section was consistent with what I'd observed. Drainage channel dimensions, arch geometry, portal head walls all consistent. Except for one thing. The 1957 documents included a service alcove at the 760-foot mark. A recessed space on the west side of the bore, originally designed for maintenance personnel to step clear of traffic during active operations. Roughly 4 feet deep, 6 feet wide, with a metal door giving access to a cable routing corridor that ran parallel to the bore for approximately 200 feet before dead-ending. I had walked the Harwick bore twice. I had photographed every wall irregularity in my documentation. I had no photograph of a service alcove at the 760-foot mark, and I had no note of one. The cable corridor was not in any maintenance record after 1961. The 1973 resurfacing documents included a note that the alcove door had been sealed during lining work. Sealed, not removed. The concrete lining would have gone over it. If the seal was flush with the surrounding wall surface, and if the original alcove depth was modest enough, you could walk past it without knowing it was there. You'd need to be measuring the wall thickness to find it, or looking for a seam. I had not been measuring wall thickness. I had not been looking for seams. I pulled up my photographs from both visits and went through them frame by frame. At the 760-foot mark, or close to it, I couldn't be precise because I hadn't been tracking footage position against distance markers the way I would for a wall survey. There was a photograph showing a section of bore lining with a linear crack running roughly vertical, about 18 inches long, classified in my notes as a shrinkage crack, low priority. I'd measured the width at 0.3 millimeters. I'd moved on. Looking at it again, I noticed the crack was perfectly vertical. Shrinkage cracks in a concrete arch lining are almost never perfectly vertical. They follow stress lines, which in an arched structure tend to run at angles relative to the keystone. A perfectly vertical crack in a section of lining that happened to have been applied over a sealed door in 1973 was not a shrinkage crack. It was the door frame. I sat back from the laptop, the undocumented cameras, the monitor with its separate feed, the figure on cam 5 before I arrived, and now a sealed-over service access point in the middle of the bore at a position that happened to fall between two of the undocumented camera angles. I thought about the green indicator lights on the camera housings. Solid green, not blinking, not intermittent. Solid green on a camera indicator usually means active connection, live transmission. Those cameras were transmitting to something. The monitor was receiving from something. And whatever network that comprised was not the DOT's infrastructure. Someone had installed a private surveillance system inside a state tunnel. And somehow, that system had footage of me on the morning of my inspection before the morning of my inspection had started. I finished my notes, closed my laptop, and looked out the window of my home office at the street outside. Ordinary Tuesday evening. A neighbor walking a dog. The last of the light going out of the sky in the west. I thought about calling Sandra again, about telling her the rest of it. The monitor image, the vest, the sealed alcove, the camera network, about letting the DOT inquiry absorb it, and watching it disappear into a bureaucratic process that might produce a report in 18 months. I thought about my daughter's finger catching in the torn reflective tape, about a system I hadn't installed showing me somewhere I hadn't been yet. I wrote down the alcove coordinates as precisely as I could estimate them from my photographs. 760 feet, west wall. I wrote down the panel thickness of a standard 1957 concrete lining, 8 inches over the original shotcrete, according to the construction documents. I wrote down what a sealed metal doorframe would look like under 8 inches of concrete if you put a rebar locator over it. I had a rebar locator in the truck. I wrote, June 11th, 6 a.m. window. Bring the locator. June 11th was a Wednesday. I drove up Tuesday evening. Same motel, same room as both prior visits because I hadn't asked for a different one, and they just kept assigning it. Room 7, end of the row, parking directly in front. I'd started to recognize the particular sound the heater made when it cycled on a low tick, followed by a sustained hum that dropped half a pitch after about 90 seconds. Small things become familiar quickly when you return to a place. I ate at the diner across the highway. I'd eaten there on both prior trips, always the same counter seat because the other option was a booth that wobbled. The woman who worked the evening shift remembered me, or remembered that I was the tunnel inspector who came through occasionally, which is a different kind of remembering, but still meant she brought coffee without being asked. I appreciated that. I didn't sleep well. Not because I was frightened, exactly. More like the feeling you get before a difficult conversation you've been postponing, a low-level alertness that keeps pulling you out of sleep every hour or so to remind you it's still there. At 2 in the morning, I got up, sat at the desk, and read through the 1957 construction documents again on my laptop. I'd downloaded the full scan from the county portal, 61 pages. Poor quality. Some pages barely legible. I worked through the alcove section carefully. The service alcove had been designated Maintenance Access Point C. There were also A and B. A was near the north portal, B near the south. Both A and B appeared in the 1989 electrical upgrade documents, described as active and accessible. I'd seen both during my inspections. They were small, unimpressive spaces, a recessed door, a junction box inside, conduit running in and out. Nothing unusual. Maintenance Access Point C was mentioned in the 1957 original and in a 1961 supplemental document about the cable routing corridor. After 1961, nothing. The 1973 resurfacing specification mentioned sealing it, as I'd already noted. But the 1961 supplemental document had something I'd missed on first read. The cable routing corridor that ran behind Access Point C, the 200-foot dead-end corridor, had been constructed to house ventilation control wiring. The original bore design had included a mechanical ventilation system, apparently considered necessary given the tunnel's length and the diesel traffic loads of that era. By 1961, the ventilation system had been redesigned, the mechanical components removed, and the wiring made redundant. The corridor was described as emptied, inspected, and sealed. But the 1961 document also noted that the corridor had been found during the 1961 inspection to be dry and structurally sound. It described the corridor dimensions in enough detail that I could estimate its current state, assuming no major deterioration. Roughly 5 feet wide, 6 feet tall, running parallel to the bore's west wall, from approximately the 760-foot mark to approximately the 960-foot mark. A 200-foot corridor inside the ridge, with one sealed access point. Dry, structurally sound in 1961, sealed in 1973. 53 years since anyone had documented being inside it. I thought about the camera network. about a system that required installation hardware, cabling, power. Someone had mounted those cameras inside the bore, done it without authorization, without permits, without the DOT's knowledge. That kind of installation takes time, takes return visits, requires somewhere to stage equipment and run connections. You can't do it from the bore itself without a place to work from. A dry, sealed, 200-foot corridor with a concealed access point at mid-bore would be exactly the kind of place you'd use. I wrote that down. Then I sat with the implication of it for a few minutes. Someone had been using the space behind the sealed wall. The cameras were their cameras. The monitor in the north end enclosure was their monitor, or connected to their network, at minimum. And their system had footage of me at the delamination section at 5:47 a.m. on the morning of my May inspection, 25 minutes before I entered the bore. I kept coming back to that. Every other piece of it had an explanation that was unsettling, but not impossible. Unauthorized installation, private network, sealed historical infrastructure. All of it was strange, but strange in ways that fit within the boundaries of what people actually do. Trespass, unauthorized use, surveillance. The 0547 footage didn't fit. And the thing about working in structural inspection for 11 years is that when one element of a system doesn't fit, you don't explain it away. You treat it as the most important element. I was at the tunnel by 5:45, earlier than my window, which officially opened at 6, but I wanted to look at the exterior before Diane arrived. The north portal in the early morning looks like what it is, a concrete arch set into a hillside, stained with decades of exhaust and weathering, the road disappearing into it like a throat. I'd stood in front of it 4 times now, and it looked the same each time. The portal head wall had the deferred maintenance you'd expect. Some cracking at the corners, vegetation starting to infiltrate the joint between the head wall and the slope above. All documented. I walked the shoulder to the west side of the portal and looked at where the hillside met the concrete. If the cable corridor had an exterior access point, something from the original construction that might have been sealed or buried, it would be somewhere in this area. The corridor ran from the 760-foot mark westward, so its far end would be roughly 200 feet into the hillside from the portal. The hillside itself was heavily overgrown on the upper slope. Some mature trees, a lot of secondary growth. I wasn't going to find anything in the dark with a flashlight and 15 minutes. I took some photos, noted the area, and walked back to the portal approach when I saw Diane's truck turning in. She seemed in good spirits that morning. She mentioned her granddaughter. I signed the sheet, suited up, and clipped on the rebar locator alongside my usual kit. The rebar locator. The full name is a cover meter, or sometimes a rebar scanner works on electromagnetic induction. You run it along a concrete surface, and it detects the reinforcing steel underneath, gives you depth and approximate spacing. What I was counting on was that the 1957 construction had used steel framing around the access point door. A door frame leaves a different metallic signature than rebar, more mass, different geometry, concentrated rather than distributed. I walked the bore to the 760-foot mark, or as close as I could estimate it. I was counting paces and cross-referencing with the overhead lighting fixtures, whose spacing I'd recorded in my March documentation. The amber sodium light felt thicker in the middle section of the bore, something about the way the ventilation moved or didn't move. Or maybe I was just more aware of the bore's particular atmosphere than I'd been on earlier visits. I found the vertical crack, my marker from the May photograph, 18 inches, perfectly vertical, 0.3 millimeter width. Standing in front of it now, knowing what I thought I knew, the regularity of it was more obvious. Shrinkage cracks have a slightly wandering quality. They're following internal stress, so they deviate, This one didn't deviate. I ran the rebar locator over the wall surface around the crack, starting about a foot to the right of it and moving left in slow horizontal passes. The rebar signature was consistent in the sections I'd call normal wall regular spacing, expected depth for an 8-inch lining over the original shell. Then I crossed the crack line. The signature on the left side of the crack was different, denser, concentrated at the perimeter of an area roughly 32 inches wide by 72 inches tall, the approximate dimensions of a standard maintenance access door from that era. The interior of that rectangle had minimal rebar signature, consistent with an infill rather than load-bearing concrete. They'd framed the old door opening with steel, poured concrete into it, and surfaced it with the rest of the 1973 lining. The door was there. I was standing 18 inches from it. I photographed the locator readings as best I could. The device has a small display that isn't easy to capture clearly, and I stood back and looked at the wall surface. Whatever was on the other side of that wall, in that corridor, had power. The cameras were running. The monitor in the north end enclosure was receiving signal. Power had to be coming from somewhere, and running it from the bore's electrical system without tapping into visible conduit would require access from behind the wall. I pressed my hand flat against the concrete surface, cool and slightly damp, the way tunnel concrete always is. No vibration, no sound. Then I moved down the bore toward the south portal, continuing the inspection, doing my job. I want to be clear that this was a conscious decision. I was aware that I was choosing to keep moving rather than stand at that wall and escalate immediately. I told myself it was because I needed to complete the documentation. That was part of it. But I also needed to check the CAM-5 camera position, which was close to this section, and I needed to see whether the north end enclosure was still unlocked. The CAM-5 camera was the one positioned to cover the delamination section from above, mounted at approximately the 680-foot mark. On my way south, I stopped under it and looked up. The green indicator light was on. Active connection. Live transmission. I thought about what it was transmitting to. The monitor in the enclosure, presumably. Maybe somewhere else as well. A remote receiver somewhere outside the bore, outside the hill. When I came back through on my return sweep, I stopped again at the 760-foot mark. I don't know exactly what made me do the next thing. Professional habit, maybe. The same instinct that makes you press on a cracked pipe fitting to check whether it moves, even when you already know you're going to document it and leave it for remediation. I knocked on the wall surface next to the vertical crack. Regular concrete returns a flat, dense sound, no resonance, just a dull impact. This section returned something slightly different. Not hollow exactly. The infill concrete was real. There was mass there, but the quality of the sound had a faint extension to it, a very brief reverb that you wouldn't notice if you weren't listening for it. There was a space behind the wall. I stood with my knuckles still touching the concrete, and I listened. Nothing. The ambient sound of the bore, the faint passage of traffic on the controlled single lane, the distant cycling of the old ventilation system, the soft movement of air. Then something else, very brief. Low enough that I second-guessed it immediately. A single impact from the other side of the wall, not a response to my knock. The timing was wrong. It came about 4 seconds after. Not rhythmic, just one low impact, like something settling, or a footstep, or an object set down on a hard surface. I stepped back. I stood in the amber light, and I looked at the wall, and I made myself think carefully about what I actually knew. I knew the corridor existed. I knew it had been sealed in 1973. I knew that the unauthorized camera system required someone to have been inside the bore doing installation work, and that the sealed corridor was the logical operational base for that work. I knew the corridor ran 200 feet and dead-ended. I knew the cameras were currently active. And I knew that the system had footage of me at the delamination section at 5:47 a.m., 25 minutes before I entered the bore on my May inspection. The sound I'd just heard could have been settling concrete. Could have been an animal that had found its way into the corridor from the exterior. There might be a compromised seal somewhere on the hillside end, which would be consistent with the 1961 documentation, noting that the exterior terminus had been covered rather than structurally sealed. Could have been my own sound production, mislocated by the bore's acoustics. I kept coming back to the footage. Every other element of this had a framework. This one didn't. The north end enclosure was still unlocked when I reached it, the padlock hanging open exactly as I'd left it in May. That told me one of two things. Either no one had been to the enclosure between my May visit and now, which seemed unlikely given an active camera network, or someone had been there and had chosen to leave it in the state I'd found it. I opened the enclosure. The monitor was on. Same split-screen display, 6 feeds, all active. Green timestamp running in the corner of each frame. I looked at Cam 5, the mid-bore angle, covering the delamination section. Empty. Just the bore, the sodium light, the crack in the arch lining. I looked at the current timestamp, 7:44. I stood there for 60 seconds, watching all 6 feeds. No movement on any of them. The bore was clear in both directions. Then I looked at Cam 6, the camera near the south portal. The feed showed the bore approaching the south opening, a slice of gray morning light visible at the portal edge. There was a figure standing at the south portal. Inside the bore, just before the portal threshold. High-vis vest, hard hat. Facing in, I was at the north end. I had walked from mid-bore back to the north end. The south portal was 1,600 feet behind me. I had not passed anyone in the bore. No one had entered during my inspection. The flag crew was controlling access. Diane had my sign-in sheet. The figure on CAM-6 was looking into the bore from the south portal, looking toward where I was standing. I let the enclosure door close gently, and I stood outside it with my back against the tunnel wall, and I breathed. The figure was wearing a high-vis vest and a hard hat. That was all I'd had time to register. Could be anyone. Could be Diane's husband having a look. Though the flaggers weren't supposed to leave their stations. Could be someone from the DOT inquiry arriving early. Could be another inspector. The tear in the vest had been visible on the CAM-5 image in May, because I'd been close to that camera, arm extended with the meter stick, good resolution on the left shoulder. I hadn't been close enough to CAM-6 to see a detail like that. I needed to know if the figure on CAM-6 was me. I called Diane on the radio. The flag crews carried handheld units, same channel as mine, standard protocol for the inspection window. She answered on the second call. North portal, go ahead. Can you confirm your husband is at the south portal? A pause. He's at the south. Yeah, why? Just confirming positions. I'm wrapping up at the north end. I'll be filing out your side in about 10 minutes. Copy that. I put the radio back on my vest. Diane's husband at the south portal, standing in the bore entrance. That was an explanation. Flag operators sometimes step just inside the portal threshold, out of direct traffic, a place to stand that isn't the shoulder. It was a protocol violation, technically, but not an unusual one on a quiet morning. Except that I'd been inside the bore when the figure appeared on CAM-6. I'd been walking the full length back from mid-bore to the north end for at least 20 minutes before I reached the enclosure. At no point had I passed anyone coming from the south. The bore is straight 1,600 feet of straight tube. No bends, No alcoves beyond the 2 service points near the portals. If someone had entered from the south during my return sweep, I would have seen them. Unless they hadn't entered during my return sweep. Unless the monitor was doing the same thing it had done in May. I opened the enclosure again and looked at Cam 6. The south portal end of the bore. Empty. Morning light at the portal threshold. No figure. The timestamp read 0746. 2 minutes had passed. I photographed the monitor all 6 feeds. Current timestamp visible, and I left the enclosure and walked out the north portal. Diane looked up. All done? All done. I signed out, noted my exit time on her sheet, walked to my truck, and sat there for a few minutes with the engine off. The husband had been at the south portal. That was confirmed. The figure on CAM6 had been real in the sense that it existed on that feed, but its timing was wrong. In the same way the May image had been wrong, it appeared when there was no confirmed explanation for its presence inside the bore during my inspection window. I thought about the camera positioning. Cam 5 covered mid-bore, the delamination section. Cam 6 covered the south portal interior. Both of the undocumented cameras I'd thought of as strange were specifically the ones showing me, or something that looked like me, at times that didn't align with my actual position. Cams 1 through 4 were the original DOT cameras. I hadn't looked at those feeds carefully on either visit. I'd looked at the monitor as a whole, but my attention had gone to the anomalies, to 5 and 6. I hadn't thought to study what the original cameras were showing. I started the truck, but didn't pull out. There was a question I'd been treating as peripheral that was actually central. The feeds labeled CAM5 and CAM6. Were they showing the Harwick bore? Or were they showing something that looked like the Harwick bore? The angles matched the camera positions I documented in the bore. The physical details, the wall surface, the sodium light color, the drainage channel profile were consistent with what I'd observed. But I'd never stood in front of the monitor and compared a feed to my direct view of the bore at the same moment. I'd always been at one end or the other when I accessed the enclosure, never mid-bore looking at a feed of my current position. On both occasions, when I'd seen a figure on those feeds, I had been too far away to independently confirm or deny what I was seeing. I drove to the south portal. Diane's husband was standing next to his truck, not inside the bore. He was a solid, quiet man, and he watched me pull up without particular expression. I got out and asked him directly whether he'd stepped inside the bore entrance at any point during the morning. He thought about it. Maybe 2-3 minutes ago. Heard something that sounded like it might be coming from inside. Stepped in to listen. Wasn't anything. He shrugged. Wind does strange things in those. 2 or 3 minutes ago, the CAM6 timestamp had been 0744, 0745 approximately. That aligned. He'd been inside the portal threshold for a moment, heard something, left. So the feed was real. The figure was him, and the monitor was showing it at a time consistent with when it actually happened, which meant the May incident had also been real time, which meant the figure on CAM5 at 0547 on my May inspection morning had been a real person at the delamination section at 0547. Not me. Not a timestamp error. Someone in my vest. I sat with that on the drive back to the motel to check out, and I kept sitting with it on the 2.5-hour drive home. And I didn't like where it was going, but I couldn't stop it from going there. Someone had been in the bore before my inspection window opened. Someone wearing a high-vis vest and hard hat, standing at the delamination section with a meter stick against the wall at the exact angle I use when I'm measuring crack depth, left shoulder toward the camera. Someone who knew I was coming, knew my equipment, knew my working posture, and the tear in the vest. That was the part that kept snagging. I hadn't shown anyone my vest with that tear, except my daughter. 8 weeks before the May inspection. The tear had been there since April. I hadn't documented it, hadn't mentioned it, hadn't filed a replacement request. It was personal detail, the kind of thing that doesn't exist in any record anywhere. I thought about Terrence. He'd been doing the Harwick bore for 3 years before me. He'd retired in February. I'd never met him in person. He'd handed off his route through Sandra. By email, the prior inspection reports transferred to my queue. I had his documentation, but not his number, not his address. I knew his work from his reports. Thorough, methodical. Slightly different notation system than mine, but structurally similar. I called Sandra the next morning. I told her I had a personnel question about a prior route transfer and asked whether she could give me contact information for Terrence. She asked why, which was fair. I told her I had a documentation question about the Harwick bore inspection history that his reports didn't fully address, which was true enough. She said she'd pass my contact information to him and let him reach out if he was willing. That was company policy. She wouldn't give me his number directly, but she'd relay. He called 4 days later, a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner. An older man's voice, measured, with a slight deliberateness to it, like someone who'd spent years writing precise documentation, and it had affected how he spoke. We talked for a few minutes about the Harwick bore reports. I asked about the delamination section, whether he'd seen accelerated deterioration in his final year. He said yes, he'd flagged it twice, hadn't seen action. Standard frustration. Then I asked whether he'd encountered any anomalies in the bore's monitoring system. Anything that struck him as unusual about the camera infrastructure. Silence. Not a short one. The cameras, he said. The undocumented ones. Yes. Another pause. I found the first one in my second year on the route, November. I reported it. He stopped. You've seen the report. I have. You logged a camera discrepancy. One camera, he said. When I went back in March the following year, there were 2 more. When I filed that report, Sandra said the DOT was looking into it. I didn't hear anything after that. Did you ever see the monitor? In the North End enclosure? This pause was different. Longer. The enclosure was locked both times I checked it, he said. Standard padlock. I didn't have a key. A breath. Why are you asking about the monitor specifically? I told him what I'd found. The monitor, the 6 feeds, the timestamp discrepancy in May. I kept it factual, just the sequence of events. I didn't use words like impossible. I just described what I'd documented. When I finished, he was quiet for long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. There's something I didn't put in the report, he said. He'd been on a pre-dawn visit, his last inspection of the Harwick bore, in January of the year he retired. His window had started at 6, same as mine, but he'd arrived at the site early and walked the bore entrance area in the dark before the flag crew arrived. He didn't say why. Maybe the same instinct I'd had on June 11th, wanting to look at the structure on his own terms before the official window started. He'd seen a light inside the bore, not the tunnel lighting. Those fixtures were on a timer and didn't activate until the pre-inspection period began, 30 minutes before the flaggers arrived. A different light. Mobile, from the description. Handheld. Moving at mid-bore depth, which he estimated from the portal by the apparent size of the light source. He'd stood at the portal threshold and watched it for several minutes. The light had eventually stopped moving, remained stationary for a while, then went out. He'd waited. No one had come out of the bore. After about 20 minutes, he'd gone back to his vehicle and waited for the flag crew. He'd done the inspection. He'd found nothing, no person, no equipment left behind. No evidence of recent, unauthorized entry that he could see. He'd checked the service alcoves at both ends. Both locked. He hadn't reported it. He said he couldn't give a professional reason for that. He just hadn't. "The last report I filed," he said, "I recommended the delamination for emergency priority. They moved it to standard queue. I retired 2 weeks later." A pause. "I'm glad it's your route now." I wasn't sure how to take that. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down the timeline. Terrence's mobile light in January. The camera installations accumulating over his 3 years on the route. The sealed corridor with its hidden door. The monitor receiving feeds from cameras the DOT hadn't installed. The figure at the delamination section before my entry in May. The figure at the south portal that turned out to be the flag operator, but had appeared on a feed that I'd been treating as potentially anomalous. Treating CAM-6 as anomalous had been wrong. CAM-6 was just a camera showing the south portal interior in real time. The figure had been the flag operator. Real time, accurate, correctly time-stamped. CAM-5 in May was different. The timestamp on CAM-5 showed 0547, and there was no authorized entry before 0612. But Terrence had seen a light inside the bore in January, before the flag crew arrived. Before the window opened. Someone was entering the bore outside the inspection windows, entering from a point other than the portals, or entering the portals before the flag crew arrived and leaving before them too. And on the morning of my May inspection, whoever it was had been at the delamination section at 0547, wearing my vest, wearing something that looked enough like my vest that I'd identified the tear from a camera feed, and standing with a meter stick against the wall at the angle I use. My specific vest, my specific posture, my measurement technique. I thought about the sealed corridor, about how long it had been there, about a space that had been dry and structurally sound in 1961 and sealed over in 1973, which meant whoever was using it now had either opened the sealed door from the inside, found an exterior access point, or, and this required me to sit with something I hadn't fully allowed myself to sit with, had been there before the sealing. I went back to my records and looked at the 1973 resurfacing document again. The passage about sealing access point C was brief. 5 words in a materials specification table. Access point C infill sealed. No inspection note. No confirmation of empty space prior to sealing. No signature of a visual check. Standard practice would be to confirm the space was clear before sealing it. Standard practice in 1973 on a secondary state highway project with minimal oversight might not always happen. I sat with that for a long time. Then I booked the motel for July 3rd, a Thursday. I requested the early window 5:30 entry instead of 6, citing active structural monitoring for the delamination remediation, which was now officially in the queue and gave me legitimate cause to request extended access. 5:30. That would put me inside the bore at roughly 5:35. 12 minutes before the CAM-5 timestamp from May. I packed differently this time. The rebar locator. My standard kit. A good flashlight, not just my headlamp. A pry bar, the kind we carry for drainage channel work. Short-handled, heavy. And a second radio, handheld, set to a channel outside the standard flag crew frequency. I didn't examine too carefully why I was packing the pry bar. The drive up on July 2nd felt different from the prior drives. Not worse, more deliberate. I'd spent 3 months moving towards something without fully committing to it, and now I was past the point where I could file a report that covered all the relevant facts and step away. What I'd been documenting was no longer a maintenance anomaly. It was something else, and I needed to understand what it was. I thought about my daughter, the whole drive up. About the card game with the shifting rules. About the torn reflective tape on my left shoulder that I still hadn't replaced. About a figure standing at the delamination section at 0547, wearing my vest, measuring a crack that I would measure again 25 minutes later. Room 7. The heater ticking on at 2 in the morning, dropping half a pitch after 90 seconds. I didn't sleep at all. The flag crew that morning was different. Diane had a conflict. She'd mentioned it when I confirmed the window. Something about a family obligation. Her granddaughter again. And she'd arranged a substitute through the dispatch service. 2 men I hadn't met, quiet and professional, who arrived at 5:20 and had both portals set up by 5:28 without any conversation beyond what was necessary. I signed in at the north portal at 5:31. The substitute wrote my entry time without comment. The tunnel lighting wasn't on yet. The pre-inspection activation was set for 5:50 on the extended window, which I'd known when I requested it. I had my headlamp and the flashlight. The headlamp stayed on my hard hat. I carried the flashlight in my left hand, the pry bar in my right, clipped to my vest loop by its carabiner so my hand was free. I want to describe what the bore is like in complete darkness, because it matters. It's not like a dark room or a dark street. The darkness in a tunnel has pressure to it. The space is defined, the air is enclosed, and your light source throws shadows that the architecture bounces back at you in ways that outdoor darkness doesn't. The walls are close enough that you're always aware of them. The ambient sound is mostly your own footsteps and breathing, amplified slightly, returned to you from surfaces 8 feet away. You become very aware of your own sounds. You become very aware of any sound that isn't yours. I moved at a measured pace, not fast. I was checking wall surfaces with the flashlight as I went, building a record of what I was seeing, staying methodical. I reached the 400-foot mark, then 500. The air smelled the same as it always did, concrete and exhaust residue, and the particular mineral dampness of old lined stone. At roughly the 680-foot mark, I stopped. The CAM-5 camera was above and ahead of me, invisible in the dark, but I knew its position. I stayed still for about 30 seconds and listened. Nothing unusual. The faint tick of the bore settling, or the ventilation system dormant somewhere in the walls. The sound of the highway at both portals, distant and thin. I moved forward to the 760-foot mark, the sealed door. It was 5:43 by my watch. I stood in front of the wall and put the flashlight beam on the vertical crack, and I listened again. Nothing from the other side. I pressed my palm flat against the concrete. Cool, slightly damp, unchanged. At 5:45, I turned and looked back toward the north portal. In the complete darkness, the portal opening was a gray rectangle in the distance, faint pre-dawn light from outside making just enough distinction between the opening and the wall. No figure silhouetted there, no movement. I looked south. The same. A gray rectangle far away. I turned back to the wall, and I thought about what I was actually doing. I had a pry bar. The sealed door was 8 inches of infill concrete over a 1957 steel frame. Even a compromised infill wasn't something a pry bar would address. I wasn't going to break through a concrete wall with hand tools. I'd known that when I packed it. The pry bar was for something else, for the possibility of a door that had been opened before, that might show seam evidence, that might have a point of compromise along its frame, that wasn't visible under inspection lighting. I ran the flashlight beam slowly around the perimeter of the door-shaped area the rebar locator had mapped. Top edge first. The concrete surface was uniform, left side, top to bottom. Uniform. Bottom edge, which ran along the floor of the drainage channel. I crouched down and put the flashlight close to where the left side of the doorframe met the drainage channel floor. The channel was concrete, about 8 inches wide, 4 inches deep, running the full length of the bore along the west wall. Standard drainage. There was a gap, not large, maybe a 1/4 inch, running along the base of the wall for about 3 feet. The kind of gap that develops when a floor section settles slightly away from a wall common, usually unremarkable. I had notes on drainage channel wall gaps from half a dozen inspections, but this one ran exactly along the base of where the doorframe would be. And when I put my flashlight beam parallel to it and looked along the gap's length, I could see that the gap wasn't uniform. It was slightly wider at the 2 points that would correspond to the lower corners of the doorframe, as if something had compressed the concrete at those points repeatedly over time, as if the door had been opened and closed enough times that the lower corners had worked the floor material slightly loose. I fit the flat end of the pry bar into the gap at the left lower corner and applied lateral pressure, not trying to break anything, just probing for give. The section of wall moved. Not much. A millimeter or two of lateral shift, a very faint grinding sound of concrete on concrete, and then resistance. But it moved. The infill was not bonded to the frame on this side. It was held by its own weight and by the compression of the surrounding lining, but it had been separated from the frame at some point, and whatever was holding it in the channel gap was the only thing keeping it flush. I stood up and stepped back. My watch said 5:49. 2 minutes. I stood in the dark bore, and I thought about Terrence's mobile light in January, about someone at the delamination section at 0547 wearing my equipment, my posture, the specific tear on my left shoulder that my daughter had made by catching her finger in the reflective tape, about what it meant that this wall moved, about the corridor behind it, 200 feet long, sealed in 1973, described as dry and structurally sound in 1961, running parallel to the bore from this point south to roughly the 960-foot mark. About the cameras transmitting to a monitor in an enclosure that the DOT hadn't installed. About the exterior terminus of the corridor, somewhere in the hillside above and west of the north portal, covered rather than structurally sealed in the original documentation. Someone had been using this corridor, was using it, had installed a camera network from inside it, running cables through the conduit paths that the 1957 construction had left behind, had accessed the bore from behind this wall, had been inside the bore before my inspection windows, and had been captured on their own cameras doing something that looked exactly like my inspections. I thought about that last part, until it became the only part. Looked exactly like my inspections. The same equipment, the same posture, the same vest, the same measurement technique at the same deficiency location. This wasn't surveillance of my inspections. This was rehearsal of them. Or replication. Someone who had watched my prior visits in enough detail to reproduce the specific physical grammar of how I work, the angle of the meter stick, the way I position my left shoulder when I'm measuring, details that would require close, repeated observation from the camera angles available, and had gone to the delamination section before I arrived and stood there with a meter stick against the wall. Why? I had no answer to that. I still don't, fully. But standing in that bore at 5:51, 2 minutes after the wall had moved under the pry bar, what settled into me was not a theory, but a physical understanding. The kind that comes from the body rather than the mind. The same way you know a structure is genuinely compromised before you can articulate the specific failure mode, something in the way it responds to load that your hands recognize before your training can name it. Whatever was in that corridor had been watching me long enough to become something like me, had been practicing, had wanted to be seen on those cameras doing what I do, had arranged it so that I would see it. It wanted me to open the wall. I put the pry bar back on my vest clip. I picked up the flashlight. I turned around and I walked back toward the north portal. Not fast. I want to be clear about that. I did not run. I walked at the same measured pace I'd come in at, checking surfaces, staying methodical. Partly because panic in an enclosed space is its own hazard, and I've known that for 20 years. Partly because I needed to think. The tunnel lighting came on at 5:50, sodium vapor, amber and thick, filling in from both ends toward the middle. I was at the 400-foot mark when the lights reached me, and I kept walking. I filed out at the north portal at 5:58. The substitute flag operator noted my exit time. I signed out. He didn't ask any questions. I sat in my truck for a long time. What I'd found and what I'd understood were two different things, and I knew that one of them was documentable and one of them wasn't. I had photographs. I had the rebar locator readings. I had the motion in the wall under the pry bar, which I couldn't prove to anyone because I'd been alone. I had 3 months of documented anomalies that built a coherent picture of unauthorized installation and access. All of that was real. All of it could go in a report, and none of it explained what I'd seen on the monitor in May. None of it explained the tear in the vest. I called Sandra at 8 that morning. I told her I was pulling myself from the Harwick bore rotation and that she needed to get another inspector assigned immediately. I told her the structure required a full engineering review, not a routine maintenance inspection, and that I'd file a detailed report by end of week. She heard something in how I said it and didn't push back. She said she'd reassign the route. I filed the report Friday morning. 19 pages. Unauthorized camera installation. Network hardware in the north end enclosure. Structural evidence of access point C compromise. Recommendation for full bore closure. Pending investigation of unauthorized entry. I included all the photographs. I included the rebar locator readings. I included Terrence's documented camera discrepancy from his route. I did not include the monitor image from May. I did not include my description of the figure at the delamination section at 547. I've thought about that omission a lot. It's the one place in all of this where I can't fully account for my own decision. The professional explanation is that a photograph of a monitor showing a time-stamped feed is not sufficient documentation without corroborating server records. And the DOT server records showed no footage before 6 a.m. on that date, which made the monitor image unverifiable and potentially contradictory to the official record. That's true. That's a real reason. But the actual reason is that I couldn't write a report that included the torn reflective tape. I couldn't submit a document that said, the figure on camera was wearing my vest, specifically with a specific tear made by my daughter 8 weeks prior. And I know this because I have been unable to repair that torture because of what it means to me. That wasn't a finding. That was something else, and it belonged somewhere else. The DOT investigation found the corridor in September. They cut through the sealed door from the bore side with proper equipment and surveyed the space. The report summary, which I received as a CC on a follow-up to my original complaint, described the corridor as a disused 1957 maintenance passage, structurally sound. Showing evidence of recent occupancy, that's the word they used. Occupancy, including power distribution hardware, a cellular network repeater, coaxial cabling connecting to the camera system, and food storage containers, empty. No personal effects, no identification, no one found in the space. They noted that the exterior terminus of the corridor, on the hillside above the north portal, had been cleared at some point, the covering material removed, and a new hatch installed. Stainless steel, weatherproof, the kind of thing you'd source from a marine supply catalog. Custom fit to the original opening dimensions. They never found who installed it. The camera system was removed. The monitor was removed. The Harwick bore was closed for 3 weeks, reopened, and assigned to a different inspector whose name I don't know. I replaced the vest in October. I ordered a new one from the same supplier, same model, and I wore it on my first inspection after I came back from a week off. It felt the same. It performed the same. The left shoulder was intact. My daughter asked about it on a Saturday in November. We were in my kitchen. She was sitting on the counter watching me make lunch, and she said, "Where's the ripped one?" I told her I'd gotten a new one. She said, "I liked the ripped one," with the tone of someone who is 9 and considers this a complete argument. I said I'd liked it too. She accepted that and moved on to something else, the way children do, dropping one subject and picking up another without any awareness of what they've just walked through the edge of. I finished making lunch. She ate half of hers and left the rest. We played 2 rounds of her card game and she changed the rules both times, and I lost both times, legitimately. I think about the corridor sometimes, about the space behind the wall, 200 feet, dry and structurally sound, about someone living in it, or using it. The distinction matters, and I've never been able to settle it. About the camera feeds, and the monitor, and someone watching me work, and going to the places I'd been, and standing the way I stood. I've tried to construct a rational profile, an obsessive, a stalker, someone with a specific pathology I don't have the training to name. That framework fits most of the facts. It doesn't fit the timestamp. It doesn't fit the tear. What I come back to, when I come back to it, is this. The wall moved. When I put the pry bar in and applied lateral pressure, the infill shifted. A door that had been opened and closed enough times to work the floor material loose at the lower corners. And I turned around and left. Whatever was in there on the morning of July 3rd, if anything was, I don't know. I chose not to know. I made that choice consciously, with my hand still on the pry bar, and I've made it again every day since. Some findings you document. Some findings you set down carefully on the floor of a dark bore, and you walk back out into the morning light, and you sign the sheet, and you note your exit time, and you go home to your daughter, and you play a card game with rules that keep changing, and you lose, and you don't mind. The tear was on my left shoulder. She made it in April. I left it alone until October, because every time I noticed it during an inspection, it brought me back to the moment she looked up at me, preparing to be sorry, and I'd said it was fine. It's a work vest. It doesn't matter. I still think that was the right thing to say.